Right, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, view, speaker view. All right, hopefully this is recording correctly. Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, Committee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and I feel a little guilty assuming the mantle of co-chair, but Sharon Kirk is the other co-chair. And of course, gotta
Also
thank
guilty.
Dave Alden. A few quick notes. As I just mentioned, mute yourself when you're not talking. We have been Zoom bombed in the last meeting. We like to keep things open, which means that we may get Zoom bombed again. If we do and your screen goes blank, hang in there. I'll try to get back as quickly as I can, but I'm going to try to find the offending person and kick them and then restart the video. Should be less than a minute or two. If I fumble things and you get booted and think you didn't deserve it, try connecting again. I will have turned on the meeting room or the intro room, and I will interrogate you before I let you back in. This evening is the second of our general plan series, 20 months of forums intended to help Petaluma residents better understand the topics that will be addressed in the general plan update and become better advocates for land use, for the land use future they want for our town. We've got a few upcoming meetings. 3 weeks from tonight, April 14th, we will have a forum on the housing context for the general plan. 2 weeks after that, we'll talk about the environment here with particular attention on the river. For the full calendar, check out the Urban Chat website at urbanchat.org. And there's also good background material, definitions and such to help better understand what we're talking about up there. If you are not yet on the email list, sign up on the contact page of the website, urbanchat.org. The weekly updates are an amazing resource of what's going on here in town. Because this series is about the general plan update, we expect members of the City Council, Planning Commission, and General Plan Advisory Committee to attend. We love that they're here. However, to respect the intent of California's public meeting rules, we ask that questions be framed around broad land use issues rather than specifics of how the general plan should be written. And as an aside, if you ever get the chance to take the California elected and appointed officials ethics training, do so. It's fascinating. Thank you to Josh Simmons and Petaluma Civics who are rebroadcasting this meeting on Twitch and Facebook and YouTube to help us find a wider audience. And now, on to the purpose of the meeting. Natasha Juliana of Work Petaluma has done a marvelous job of securing this evening's speakers, and the floor is hers.
Thank you so much, Dan and Sharon, for inviting me to organize this forum. So our goal here tonight is to provide a base of shared understanding around what climate change means for the future of Petaluma, so that as we participate in this general plan series, we can view all subject areas through the lens of equitable climate action. We have 3 exceptional speakers lined up. Pete Gang will start us off with a brief overview of the ambitious yet necessary goals being set. Then Scott Dusterhoff will explain the environmental changes we should expect locally. And finally, Erik DeKok is going to spend the bulk of our time laying out key actions we can take to mitigate our impact and adapt as needed. So first up, Pete Gang is an architect, educator, and local climate champion. Pete and I attended Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Training together in 2017. And since then, he has worked tirelessly to push forward policies that address our climate emergency, including his work with Climate Action Petaluma, the Climate Center, and jurisdictions around Sonoma County. Thank you, Pete, for agreeing to squeeze a huge amount of info into a 5-minute intro. So take it away there.
Thank you, Natasha. I have timed my remarks. I will roar through them and hopefully be done in 5 minutes. Petaluma's climate goals. The origins of climate science go back to the 1820s when John Fourier realized that the Earth's atmosphere acts like a blanket. Next, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, was formed recognition of the understanding that climate change is indeed a looming existential threat. Next, over the course of those 33 years, levels of atmospheric CO2 have increased steadily from around 350 parts per million to around 417 parts per million. Next, in Paris in December of 2015, after decades of deliberation, the nations of the world finally reached an agreement on the climate crisis. The Paris Agreement had a stated objective of, quote, keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees C. Next. Even if all the nations that signed the Paris Agreement lived up to their emissions reduction pledges, a highly unlikely outcome, we would be living with over 3 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. And a 3-degree world is unlivable. Even worse, business as usual puts us on a path toward 4 degrees centigrade or more by 2100. And those ranges are beyond unlivable. So how and where do we set our goals? One point of understanding, the emissions coming out of our flues and tailpipes today are not our real problem. They make our real problem worse. Our real problem is all the excess CO2 and other gases that have accumulated in the Earth's climate system over the course of the last 200 years, the accumulated emissions, or the so-called legacy emissions. In order to achieve climate stability, we need to get our current emissions down to zero as fast as possible, and we need to remove or draw down vast amounts of the accumulated CO2 and CO2 emissions with a goal of climate stability much closer to pre-industrial levels. The first is usually referred to as mitigation, the second as negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal. Both are mandatory. Because time is limited, I'm intentionally not talking about adaptation or resilience. I'm only going to focus on the first part of that two-part goal, the mitigation part, getting our current emissions down to zero as fast as possible. Next slide. Current California laws, shown in blue on this graph, call for a 40% reduction in greenhouse emissions below 1990 levels by 2030, and an 80% reduction by 2050. This trajectory implies a target date for zero emissions of around 2060. Jerry Brown's more recent executive order, shown in purple, set a goal of carbon neutrality as soon as possible and no later than 2045. The 2018 IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade says that in order to have a 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we have 20 years from 2018, therefore 2038, to reach carbon neutrality. But the report adds that geophysical uncertainty translates into a variation of this timing of roughly 15 to 20 years. Thus, according to the IPCC, our target date for zero emissions may already have passed. In recognition of both climate science and political reality, our City Council adopted the target date for net zero emissions of 2030, as stated in the Climate Emergency Framework drafted by the Climate Action Commission. 2030 is 9 years from today. Our Regional Climate Protection Authority, which sets climate policy for the local jurisdictions in Sonoma County, followed Petaluma's lead and also set a 2030 target date for carbon neutrality. That's the pathway shown in green. That is what we have said is our path to zero emissions. Next slide. 2030 is a wildly ambitious but completely responsible goal, requiring that we be willing to rethink absolutely everything. That, plus the need for negative emissions and the need for adaptation strategies, is the climate context for our general plan update process. Thanks, that's all I have.
Thank you, Pete. I think Pete did a great job there helping us understand why we are calling this a climate emergency and why these next few years are so critical to our success. So I thank you for that. And you did it, 7:10. Next up, I'd like to welcome scientist Scott Dusterhoff. Scott lives here in Petaluma and works for the San Francisco Estuary Institute and Aquatic Science Center as a geomorphologist. Scott currently leads several projects in the Bay Area that focus on developing holistic management approaches that support resilient, multi-benefit landscapes. He's going to share what the science is telling us will happen as the seas rise and the weather becomes more extreme. Thank you, Scott.
Can you see my screen? Okay. Well, thank you, Natasha, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all out there and to see so many familiar faces. So as Natasha said, I'm going to be, over the next few minutes, talking about what the future will bring to Petaluma with respect to sea level rise, extreme storms, and extreme heat. And so I'll be showing you what the best available science is telling us we will be seeing with respect to these three things. So starting with sea level rise, what we have here is an aerial view of Petaluma. I'm not sure if folks, can you see my cursor? Okay, great. So just a little perspective for folks. We have the 101 bridge here, we have the D Street Bridge here, downtown Petaluma, okay? So what I'm gonna show here is what the future could bring with respect to sea level flooding with sea level rise, looking at two different levels of sea level rise, okay? So we're gonna start out with 2 feet of sea level rise. So this is just a normal tide, normal high tide that's 2 feet higher than what we would see today. And the blue indicates where there would be water, and the darker the blue, the deeper the water, okay? So under a normal tidal conditions, 2 feet of sea level rise, we see we're starting to get areas flooded that aren't flooded today. And all the red lines are showing you where we would start to get overtopping of banks. Okay, so not a tremendous amount of flooding in downtown Petaluma. And 2 feet of sea level rise is something that the science is telling us that we might see by 2050, but we would definitely see that much, or we think we'd see that much sea level rise by late in the century without a doubt. Okay, so 2 feet of sea level rise, just a normal tide. And then if it's 2 feet of sea level rise with a 10-year storm, so a big storm sitting on the bay that's blowing a lot of wind and blowing a lot of bay water up into the Petaluma River, it would look something like this, okay? So again, the red showing where the banks are overtopping. We'd start to see flooding here along Petaluma Boulevard, flooding here as well. I live right down here, so it hasn't hit my neighborhood yet. But we would be getting overtop banks with 2 feet of sea level rise and a big wintertime storm blowing water up into the river. Okay, so that's 2 feet. Now let's increase it to 5.5 feet of sea level rise. So this is something that we might see by mid-century, but science is telling us we would most likely see this by later in the century, by 2070, 2080. Okay, so normal tidal conditions, we'd be getting flooding out along Petaluma Boulevard here. We'd be getting flooding up in here as well. And then if you add a big wintertime storm on the bay to that, all the water being blown upstream, we'd be getting quite a bit of flooding in these parts of Petaluma. Okay, so just a quick indication on what we think we could be seeing in the future with a higher sea level and what wintertime storms could do to that bay level and that water level and the flooding that we could be seeing. Okay, so next, let's look upstream and let's look at what's coming with respect to big wintertime storms that sit on the watershed and bring flows down to downtown Petaluma. So I'm going to show you 3 storms, starting with what I'm calling here a big winter storm or a 2-year storm event. So this is a storm that we would see on average every other year. Okay, and starting out with what we saw historically. So historical here being the period from 1961 to 1990. And so what I'm going to be showing you is the amount of rain associated with these storms, okay? And so for this big wintertime storm, historically, we saw about 3 inches of rain for a 2-year event, okay? Now I'm going to show you what the climate models are telling us. And we're going to be looking at results from these 4 climate models. And these are the ones that the state of California focuses on for doing its climate science. And you don't need to worry about the names of the models. It's just what they're telling us. So the dark red would be a warmer, drier climate. The blue, it's called cooler, wetter, but it's still warmer. It's just the coolest of the warmer futures, if that makes sense. But the state of California calls it the cooler, wetter future. So red is much drier. Blue is wetter than what we have now. Both of them still warmer. Green, we're calling average conditions. And then this purple one is called a complement. It just is included because it's so different from the other 3. Okay, so these are the 4 climate models we're going to look at. So for this big wintertime storm, a 2-year storm, historically, we had about 3 inches of rain. Climate models are telling us that by mid-century, conditions would be somewhat similar for 2 of the models, the red and the purple, but the green and the blue were showing about 1 inch more rain for this type of storm. And just for some quick context, 1 inch of rain falling over the entire watershed is about 800 million gallons of water. Okay, so that's enough water to fill 1,200 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So 1 more inch of rain equals a heck of a lot more water coming into our rivers. Okay, so that's what the climate models are telling us for mid-century. And then by the end of the century for this 2-year storm event, the purple is about the same as what we have historically, but the other 3 are showing at least 1 inch more rain. Okay, so for this storm in the future, we think that it's getting bigger. 3 of the models are telling us we'd be getting more rain. So now let's look at a 10-year storm event. So a once in a decade storm that hits the Petaluma River watershed. Historically, about 5 inches of rain for that type of storm. Models are telling us by mid-century, 1 model's telling us we'd see less rain. The other 3 are telling us we'd see more, up to almost 2 inches more. And then by the end of the century, 3 of the models are telling us we'd see at least 1 inch more rain for this type of storm. Okay, so more, basically a bigger storm. Now the big storm, the once in a 100-year storm here. Historically, about 8 inches of rain. Models are telling us by mid-century, we'd be getting up to 12 inches of rain for that type of event. And then by the end of the century, all 4 models are telling us we'd see about the same as we saw historically, if not a few inches more. Okay, so the point here being that whether we have a wetter future or a drier future, large storms are going to be getting larger. So 2-year storms, 10-year storms, 100-year storms are going to likely be bringing more rain to the watershed and more flow coming in to our rivers. And then the last piece to mention here is air temperature. Okay, so all climate models, whether we have a wetter future or a drier future, they all are predicting that for this part of California, summers will be longer and hotter. Okay, so let's see what that means. So we know that between 1960 and 1991, in Petaluma, we had on average about 4 days per summer that were hotter than 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So 98 degrees is considered the tipping point for extreme heat conditions. So above that temperature, it's extreme heat. Okay, so historically, about 4 days per summer on average, we saw those extreme heat conditions. The climate models are telling us that by 2100, okay, we'd be seeing between 13 and 31 days per summer that are hotter than 98 degrees. Okay, so more than doubling at least of the days per summer that are going to be in the extreme heat conditions, right? So there are obvious impacts for human health. There's obviously obvious impacts for vegetation, obvious impacts for wildlife. And then the last thing to mention here is the impact that a warmer, drier summer has on soil moisture. Okay, so the moisture available for plants. So what we see here are 2 maps showing results from climate modeling from a few years ago. The colors indicate what's called a percent change in climatic water deficit, but all that means is a percent change in soil moisture, so the water that's available for plants. And what I circle here is where we are in Petaluma. And all the colors except for the darkest blue show an a decrease in soil moisture, okay? And the hotter the colors, the greater the decrease. So this model run is telling us we'd see up to a 30% decrease in the soil moisture compared to the soil moisture we have today. Okay, so all this means we're going to have changing vegetation conditions, we're going to have stressed wildlife, we're going to have hotter urban areas, and then the other piece to consider here is wildfire, right? There's going to be a greater wildfire risk associated with these, the doubling, if not tripling of days per summer we have above 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's all I wanted to run through for you real quick here, and just what the best available science is telling us we could be seeing in the Petaluma River watershed with respect to sea level rise, extreme storms, and extreme heat.
Perfect. Another right on time. Thank you, Scott. Since the general plan will inform our built environment for decades to come, we can see why keeping these changes in mind will be vitally important. So moving right along, finally, we're excited to have joining us from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Erik DeKok. As Program Manager of Planning and Community Development, Erik leads the team's efforts on developing local and regional planning guidance that furthers the state's climate goals. Key focus areas include sustainable land use, housing, transportation and infrastructure, infill development and finance, climate action, adaptation and resilience planning, community-based investment and social equity, public health, and environmental justice. I think that just about covers everything we could possibly think of. Erik is going to lead us through some key actions as we can take as we mitigate our impact and adapt as needed, which hopefully will give us something to take away now that we've heard some of the bad news. So Erik, please take it away and give us some action items.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Natasha, for inviting me into this space today. Great to be here in the Petaluma Urban Chat with you all. A really good group here. A few familiar faces, but most of you I don't know. So nice to meet you all. I'm coming to you live here from Sacramento, despite my background, which is actually your lovely Sonoma County coast, a photograph I took a few months back when I was there on a sunny day. I just love the region that you're in, and you are lucky to be in one of California's most beautiful spots. So really, anyway, great to be here. Let me quickly share my screen and we'll get going with the presentation. Just give me a quick moment. This is always a little tricky. All right, and can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Hope so. Great, awesome. So I'll talk about OPR, a little bit about me first. So I'm a planner with a couple decades of experience of working in California. I did a lot of work in local government for about 10 years, including work on a very important general plan update in California here, the city of Sacramento's general plan. I also helped develop some of the city's first climate action plans about 10 years ago. So I sort of know the drill between the relationship between climate and the general plan. I've been talking about this for quite some time. I also have done some consulting work statewide on general plans and climate, and that was one of my specialties prior to coming to OPR about 18 months ago. So just really, I'm very passionate about this topic and excited to share a little bit with you today. So OPR, as many might know, we are the state's planning agency. We are housed within the governor's office, just like the Office of Emergency Services or the governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. So we sort of sit there within the state bureaucracy. We are the sort of the keepers of the guidance and the governor's policy arm on planning and community development matters, and also not unimportantly, the California Environmental Quality Act. We are the keepers of those guidelines, and we do issue and maintain those bodies of guidance for general plans and CEQA, as well as technical advisories that illustrate kind of technical approaches to complying with state law and planning. A lot of other roles that we serve: we are the state's military liaison for planning matters. We do a lot of interagency coordination across all state agencies as state agencies are planning and making sure that those planning efforts are coordinated and aligned as much as possible. And definitely within our agency, we do have our Strategic Growth Council, which some of you may be familiar with. We have our Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, or ICARP, a part of our agency that my team, the planning team, works very regularly with, as well as our state, the CEQA clearinghouse. So onto the subject matter for tonight. I mean, the big message I think I want everyone to take away with is that, you know, we firmly believe, and I think many already have grasped this for years, but that planning really now must address both the causes and consequences of climate change. And these are sort of our co-equal goals in California. And we really believe that updating a general plan, a community's long-range plan, is a critical opportunity now because the problem of climate change is just such a big issue, and it sort of presents a full spectrum of the classic planning dilemma, and it's an opportunity for taking action. It's long-range in nature, it's comprehensive in scope, and it's significant in impact. So it's just the perfect planning tool really to address this very large-scale issue. Some of the key challenges, of course, in addressing climate and planning at the local level that we've been monitoring, and I can speak to also from personal experience, is there are just many still remaining political barriers and concerns about leveling the playing field. There being an unlevel playing field at this issue. Of course, this is improving over time as more and more actions are being taken at the local level as well as state and national levels. But you know, we are moving into a space now where those political barriers need to be overcome. We have educating and engaging the public about the needs and co-benefits of action. We'll talk about that a little bit. I really view today's chat with you all as sort of part of that need, and that we're starting to overcome that challenge with these community conversations. Another big need, of course, is finding funding and financing solutions for transformative change across all sectors. And so this is obviously something I'll be touching tonight a little bit further in my remarks, but we definitely are sensitive to that and know that any level of government can't really take adequate and aggressive action on climate change unless we are resourcing those efforts. So we'll speak to that too. And finally, you know, the climate response, the climate emergency is dear, it is dire, but we must make sure, and this is our statewide goal as well, that any climate responses in the state are equitable, that they're just, and that they're promoting a healthier future for all Californians. So that's something that we believe can be taken to heart at the local level as well, and we'll be speaking to that in the slides here. So when I talk about climate resilience in my presentation, I'm not just talking about adaptation. We at OPR believe that the integration of our responses to climate change must be comprehensive as well as integrated as much as possible. And I think a lot of folks do grasp this, but we really do believe that mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, working towards carbon neutrality or carbon negativity, does need to be aligned and overlaps very much with many of the adaptive responses to the impacts of climate change, which you already heard about tonight. So we really want to help folks think holistically about climate resilience in planning. You know, so when we're looking at the climate action plan as well as the function of the general plan, there's a really important nexus there that we want to make sure folks are thinking about. Our guidance does speak to what's required in the general plan guidelines. So for those of you that are actively working in general plan work or supporting the city's efforts or working through advisory committees, you might be getting this general plan 101 if you haven't already. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I just want to note that these bigger issues about healthy communities, climate change, equity and resilience, they're not necessarily mandatory topics, right? The mandatory topics are sort of shown on the left here. We have land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise, safety, air quality, environmental justice. These are all the mandatory things that must be in a mandatory topics or elements, if you will, that must be in a general plan. And climate change and the climate change responses are really, we have topical guidance, but OPR doesn't have any one approach that we recommend. You know, climate change can be addressed as a separate standalone element of a general plan. It could be spread throughout a general plan. There can be a climate action plan that's separate and apart from a general plan that the general plan refers to. And so that's an approach that we definitely support. And there really is up to the local agency in terms of what approach to take there. Just a few other notes about California's landscape for addressing climate. Climate adaptation, of course, is required to be addressed in general plan safety element now. That took effect in the year 2015 when Senate Bill 379 was passed. And we also do have guidance on climate change and how a general plan must address greenhouse gas emissions. There is no analog to SB 379 for greenhouse gas mitigation. Local governments can basically choose whether and how to address that issue. CEQA, of course, does remain the primary mandate that is driving greenhouse gas mitigation strategy development at the planning and project scale. And so that tends to be a really important mandate and a driver for addressing climate issues in the general plan. Another important body of guidance does exist in CARB's climate change scoping plan. This is the state's climate action plan, if you will. And CARB has taken time and effort in prior versions of the scoping plan to provide guidance for local and regional action on climate change. And so some of that guidance is foundational for sort of setting the boundaries around greenhouse gas emissions analysis, as well as what sort of targets or goals need to set. So we really encourage local agencies and communities to look at these bodies of guidance and think of them as a kind of a cohesive, mutually reinforcing set of guidance on how to mitigate emissions and work towards resilience. So as I mentioned, a climate action plan, it's a standalone plan. There is no body of law that governs climate action plans currently in California. They are essentially voluntary plans, and they can focus on either mitigation or climate adaptation resilience. They can be community focused. Some climate action plans tend to be very focused on a municipal operations of an agency, but we see a lot of climate action plans doing both now. You know, I already mentioned that they're not specifically required by law, and they exist as standalone plans and can be integrated into other plans like the general plan, as I mentioned earlier. For those of you not familiar with what goes into climate action planning around greenhouse gas mitigation, this is sort of the basic steps in the process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here explaining all these steps, but just know that our guidance does reinforce kind of the typical 5 to 6 step cycle of inventorying emissions, looking at long range forecasts, setting goals and targets, developing and adopting an action plan, implementing that plan, and then monitoring its effectiveness over time. And then for those communities that choose to do so, to celebrate and recognize achievement when certain goals or objectives are achieved. So now I want to get to the meat of sort of what you invited me here today to talk about, which is really the planning strategies and sort of some of the challenges with planning to address both greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation and the bigger issue of climate resilience. And I'm going to start off by talking about sort of the nexus between these different building blocks of planning, especially focusing on land use, housing, and transportation. You know, a lot of the research and the science of planning tells us that there is a dynamic relationship between the use of land, the planned or permitted uses of land, and how we achieve our housing goals, and then how our transportation infrastructure and really the behaviors that people engage in to move around in a community can result in different outcomes. And obviously, you know, planners for a long time have been talking about sustainable and smart growth, right? This idea that we need to think differently about how we plan, that we've made mistakes in our history in this country, and especially in California, of allowing a lot of inefficient growth patterns that has resulted in sort of financial liabilities for growing costs of repairing or restoring poorly designed infrastructure to support low density development. We've had tremendous issues with just consumption and loss of wetlands and farmlands and other natural and working lands that are so valuable and what make California unique. So, you know, 10 to 20 years ago, the state did, there was a law that passed that did put into state law what we call the state's planning priorities. And I've provided the legal citation here, but it really calls for sort of planning decisions that first of all, prioritize infill, compact, and sort of transit-oriented development in our urbanized or urbanizing communities. The second big priority in the state's planning priorities are to ensure efficient growth patterns that outside of urban areas when we do see growth happening, such as like agricultural communities, forested communities, smaller rural towns that maybe aren't really connected to the urban context. And then last but not least, protecting natural and working lands is a top priority as well in the state's planning priority scheme. So, you know, these three major priorities together sort of shape the guidance that OPR has developed over time for both the general plan as well as other planning tools, whether it's the specific plan guidelines and other tools and resources that we provide and advocate for. I will also say that, a really important driver in land use decision-making and planning and general plan updates moving forward is the housing element, and as well as the regional housing needs allocation that drives the maintenance and update of that housing element. As many folks know, this is the one element of the general plan that's actually regulated by the state. And it's not us, it's the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. But I did want to say that the housing element process, as well as the regional housing needs allocation process, is an important driver in land use and decision making. And it has become increasingly complex over the years. And I know that there's been a lot of work done, especially in the current cycle of the RENA process, to really address the state's growing housing crisis. And so there's increasing pressure on regions and local agencies to sort of take an increasingly larger numbers of regional housing unit allocations. This is important for meeting our housing demands, but it is putting a little bit of pressure and causing communities to think differently about how to grow and change or evolve as these larger RENA allocations are being received and housing elements are being updated. So there's a lot of technical assistance and guidance out there from HCD on some of the creative solutions. One of the things that OPR has done that I don't have time to do a full demo today, but I will just mention that OPR has a new tool called SiteCheck, and it is a sort of a GIS-based tool that allows anyone, it could be a lead agency planner, it could be a developer, it could be a community member, to sort of use data that's readily available. What we've done is created a tool that allows identification of sites that really avoid the kinds of environmental issues that could trigger CEQA, like full review. So what we're trying to do is illustrate that sometimes there are sites available, and when there are options to where housing could be cited to avoid impacts moving forward. So these are aligned with this sort of the statutory criteria in the existing CEQA exemptions that are out there. So that tool is a lot of attention being on that tool now. This is the first time the state has sort of moved into sort of this tool development around assisting agencies in making compliance about potential exemptions to sort of streamline the kind of low impact, high value urban infill and smart growth type development we would like to see in the state that's consistent with our priorities. There are many barriers that still remain to infill and compact development and efficient growth patterns. And I think that we're in full recognition of that. And the state's done a lot of work and really recognizes local planning successes that have achieved some of those outcomes. A big important factor here is leveraging the regulatory tools that exist that are already in the hands of local agencies and developers to make sure that when growth does happen, that it's in the right place. Of course, the big barriers still tend to be funding and financing, especially for infrastructure to make infill feasible and to make it work. In the death of redevelopment, there have been new tools that have emerged for this, whether it's the enhanced infrastructure financing districts and other forms of tax increment financing that are still viable. And we really encourage local communities to take a look at those opportunities. We actually just did a noontime webinar today at OPR where we highlighted a study that we prepared under legislative mandate to look at, we did an analysis of all the TIF tools that exist post redevelopment and which ones are working, which ones aren't working. And we made some recommendations to the legislature on things they can do to fix some of the tax increment financing tools to make the infill and smart growth more successful. Another key thing that's changed, and I think is a huge opportunity for changing the game around development in California, is the implementation of Senate Bill SB 743. And what this bill did is it changed the criteria and the threshold that are used in transportation analysis in CEQA away from level of service, which basically measured congestion, to a metric we called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And what this really is, it's a change in essentially the measuring stick we're using for defining transportation impacts. And the reason why this is so important for smart growth, and especially looking at land use, housing, and transportation, is that it used to be really difficult to build infill projects. So oftentimes infill projects would trigger EIRs because there were unmitigatable traffic impacts using the LOS metric. Switching to the VMT metric, we sort of flipped the situation, and it's now much harder. Greenfield developments could mitigate their way by just building more roads or widening roads. With the VMT measuring stick now, it actually makes infill much easier to do. If you look at the little map diagram that I put on the right side of the slide here, you'll see this is sort of a multicolored map of a community. I believe this is San Jose. It's just an illustrative of a map that they prepared. But the idea here is that low VMT areas, the green zones, if you will, can be considered, transportation impacts can be considered less than significant because development in those areas would already considered to be location efficient and not generate a lot more new VMT than already exists in those areas. Whereas development further out on the fringes can generate much higher levels of VMT and therefore create impacts because they're putting development further away from places where people want to be, where job centers are, and they're further away from transportation. So this change in CEQA is foundational for making it easier to do development consistent with our state planning priorities. And we're really hoping that as local communities wrestle with this change, many communities, and I even believe Petaluma is in the process of looking at this, of looking at how to implement 743 and changing CEQA procedures, that this will be a huge opportunity now, even for updating a general plan, for example, and looking at what are those circulation element metrics, what policies need to be in place given this massive change in CEQA. So we're really encouraging lead agencies in California to take a hard look at aligning their general plan and the updates to the circulation element in particular with the change in thinking around CEQA and making sure that we're not working at cross purposes and still trying to mostly just focus on mitigating traffic congestion on one plan and then in CEQA looking at a different metric. That doesn't make a lot of sense, and we really discourage folks from creating kind of policy conflict in that context. Thinking also about vehicle miles traveled, you know, there was a big report that came out, statewide report that looked at California's situation with vehicle miles traveled, and without getting into the deep weeds, our scoping plan really put a certain amount of greenhouse gas reductions on reducing VMT statewide. And we actually saw reductions over time, especially after the recession happened about 10, 11 years ago. But what we saw as the recession we moved out of the recession and into the middle of the last decade, we saw VMT increasing again. And obviously the sustainable community strategies that our regional governments and local agencies have begun to implement under SB 375, another really important bill that I won't have time to fully unpack today. We see that VMT per capita is still going up in California. And even there's been maybe a slight dip in the pandemic, but we don't believe that that's permanent, that we'll probably still see continued increases unless we see more aggressive action regionally and locally to reduce vehicle miles traveled through more effective regional and local planning. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons why we're not on track to meet our targets. A lot of this has to do with funding. And another key issue is that in Senate Bill 375, while it does require regional plans or sustainable community strategies that set aggressive targets and have regional strategies, the reality is that local land use decisions and certain types of transportation investments aren't necessarily aligning with these regional plans because regional and local planning is not required to be consistent with each other. So this is one of the flaws of SB 375, is that it doesn't really fully integrate our planning system in California. It moved the needle in an important direction, but we're still not there yet in terms of full compliance and really full effective implementation of sort of the kind of reductions we need to be seeing in vehicle miles traveled to hit our goals. So this slide now, I'm sort of flipping the equation a little bit. Instead of saying land use, housing, transportation, I'm going to start with transportation and work my way down. And this is another important framing too, in that the work that we do to reduce vehicle miles traveled isn't just dependent on land use. It's also really important to look at the kind of infrastructure investments communities are making. We've spent billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars in this country in the last 60 years on automobility infrastructure, moving cars. You know, Americans love our cars, we love our cars, but the harsh reality is we need to change that conversation, and we need to start changing our infrastructure priorities to better support the planning priorities I just talked about earlier. And we need to start not just transitioning folks to zero and low emission vehicles, but we actually also really most importantly, actually need to start diversifying the modes that we offer in our transportation system in the state and at the local level as well. This includes much more transit, much more walkability, active transportation infrastructure for walking, biking, rolling, carpooling. Any efforts we can do to expand the mobility options we offer to our citizens is important. Increasing multimodal access to destinations, for example. And there's a lot of opportunities for change and kind of cross-pollination, right, between transportation and land use in this space as well. There's important opportunities to remove barriers and kind of reconnect communities that were designed to sort of be separate from each other. You know, the worst example of this is a gated community. But of course, a lot of our subdivisions that have been built in the last few decades are not connected communities. There's maybe 1 or 2 points of ingress and egress, and the nearest shopping is a 4-mile drive. That's not the kind of communities that encourages other modes of transportation. In fact, 99% of the population in these communities is getting in their car. And we need to kind of change that conversation. We need to think about both the neighborhoods we have and the neighborhoods we want to build in the future as 20-minute neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where people can get what they need close to where they live. And for those that need to kind of go out of their neighborhoods, we need to make sure that there's clean, affordable transportation options that don't just mandate automobility as the only mode of choice. There's a lot of work that communities can do in the general plan update, and its implementation programs are around sprawl repair. You know, a lot of the work we need to do, often a general plan is often thought of what new growth is going to be happening, but actually so many of our communities that are updating general plan now in the state really need to think about right sizing and righting some of the wrongs of the past and the sprawl that has happened. You know, how do we downsize parking? How do we find opportunities to repurpose the excess parking we have? We have so much overparked development in the state, and there's so many opportunities to think about looking what's excess and thinking about how to aggregate land that we can repurpose for other important activities, whether that's more housing, more infill opportunities for housing. We can think about more green space in those areas that are mostly paved today. We can look at surplus right-of-way, you know, corridors where Caltrans or maybe a local DOT has surplus right-of-way that they could let go of. You know, we're probably not going to be widening a lot more roads in the future, and there's a lot of excess right-of-way in the state where we could kind of sell that off and maybe use that for housing. So there's a lot of ideas being kind of kicked around in that space, and we're doing a lot of work with our sister agencies. A good example of that is our Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. This is a new plan for California and how we spend transportation funds that's aligned with our climate goals. It was actually just recently released by the California State Transportation Agency and does represent the latest thinking about how to realign transportation spending priorities and better align those dollars with our planning and climate goals. So definitely encourage folks to take a look if you can go on a much deeper dive than I was able to go over today. Now I want to quite quickly end my comments tonight talking about climate adaptation planning. I do encourage folks to take a look, if you haven't before, at some of the guidance that we've provided that's actually very readable and actually very accessible into helping folks think about what makes for good climate adaptation planning moving towards resilience. There's a lot of work done in this document to really daylight how to interpret climate change science. I think Scott did an excellent job tonight of doing that for you, but there's really good guidance there. There are really important steps that are outlined about what it means to prepare a local climate change vulnerability assessment. We have a whole adaptation strategy toolkit with lots of example strategies that folks can take a look at, and I'll highlight a few in just a second. But just want to kind of highlight for you folks that this guidance is available. There's a long, difficult to navigate PDF version which you can download, but we have embedded this whole new planning guide into our adaptation clearinghouse, and it's a very user-friendly web-based and highly visual version of the document, which is really fun to navigate through. So for folks looking to take that deeper dive on climate adaptation and how a community might go through the steps in the process, definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. This is just a quick snapshot. One of the nice graphics that's in the adaptation planning guide is kind of highlights the 4 phases of climate adaptation. I won't spend a lot of time here. But I just on the actionable strategies that folks can be thinking about. I think the first place to talk about, and this really does apply to both the full climate resilience framing of planning, is really thinking about who is most vulnerable to climate, right? And who is going to be harmed the most given some of these changes. A lot of our communities of color, lower income folks that might be considered disadvantaged according to some of the state's criteria for different planning purposes. These are the folks that really folks need to be planning for first and foremost. Of course, everyone will eventually suffer, but I think the policy priority really needs to be on identifying and engaging and really prioritizing the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged communities first when we think about climate adaptation and resilience. We also really want folks to be thinking about climate adaptation as not just an infrastructure or land use issue, but it is first and foremost a human problem of really figuring out how is the community going to come together to maintain in some cases, maybe in some cases it's increased capacity in moving towards resilience, knowing that things are just going to change and probably start getting worse on a lot of different levels. And so this requires a kind of planning that I think sometimes traditional land use planners maybe aren't the best people. Maybe it's other folks in the community or other organizations that need to come around planners and really help to think that through. Obviously the economy, we've got incorporating climate risk into land use and facility siting decisions. This is a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of connecting that safety element with the land use element when you're looking at your general plan. What criteria are going to be used to identify what's at risk maybe 10 years from now, and what's the longer term time frame of 2050, 2075, 2100. What sort of framework and decision making will be incorporated into development review processes or infrastructure planning decisions over the long term. So this is definitely a strategy that we promote, and a very specific tangible strategy too, just like more tree planting. If Petaluma is going to be seeing 8 to 10 times more really extreme heat days, what does this mean? Well, what can we do today before mid-century or 3/4 of the century are gone? Is really planting those trees, right? Trees take decades to grow. So plant them now and come up with a plan for much more aggressive urban greening. And obviously it's not just about tree planting, it's about the skin of the city. It's about the skin of the community and how resilient is it to heat, especially, we can plant trees, do urban greening, retrofit parking lots. I mentioned that earlier as a infill opportunity, but it's also a climate adaptation strategy of really thinking through, how do you green the skin of a community and reduce that heat impact, but also sequester some carbon out of the atmosphere. The hard skins of our communities as well can be cool. We can have cool roofs, cool pavement, mitigating our growing urban heat island problems as temperatures increase in our cities. Definitely cool roofs are already in the building code, but a real new frontier for a lot of public works agencies is the cool pavement concept, that by changing the color or the material properties of a pavement, we can actually get huge reductions in surface temperature and heat gain, which is extremely valuable in an extreme heat environment. I could go on and on. There's so many different climate adaptation strategies to think about depending on what kind of climate impact we're thinking about. I know you're not a stranger to wildfire in Sonoma County, and we're super sensitive to that. And just know that obviously a lot of home hardening, hardening of infrastructure, looking at a community's capacity to adapt and respond, especially at the regional scale, when evacuated citizens are going from one community to another, temporary housing needs. There's so much that happens in these climate related disasters that needs to be thought through, maybe not just locally, but regionally. So we suspect that you're all coordinating regionally in Sonoma County with the county and other surrounding jurisdictions, and really strongly encourage that as you look forward to strategies for the general plan. And last but not least, I think an important framing, and I could have said this up front, is this idea of just and equitable responses to climate. Environmental justice historically has been characterized as really the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regs, and policies. That's the state's legal definition. And for those that are familiar with environmental justice, you probably know that it was historically focused around communities that were most susceptible to pollution. This idea of discrimination in land use and facility siting against people of color. So that's a pretty well documented phenomenon across the country and in California. In California, we've broadened that a little bit to look at a broader framing around public health and disproportionate health burdens. And that does somewhat relate to the traditional definition of pollution, but as now it is required in the general plan that cities do look at environmental justice and have an environmental justice element or equivalent that can look at the impacts on disadvantaged communities, who's currently disadvantaged because of past practice or past planning and structural racism, for example. And how do you move towards more just and outcome and equitable decisions around planning? Another important concept related to environmental justice and SB 1000 requirements is this idea of climate justice, and that our disadvantaged communities often bear the most disproportionate impacts to climate change. But they're also the ones that often are overlooked when it's time to invest in solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this idea that we can look at environmental justice and sort of equitable approaches to climate responses to prevent further disproportionate impacts needs to be a top priority. This applies, like I said, to both the greenhouse gas mitigation and the climate adaptation. If we really want to build community resilience and take to heart some of the work that needs to be done in the most vulnerable and disadvantaged parts of our populations, this is a huge opportunity to talk about climate justice and promoting an equitable and resilient that is equitable for all. So, and just a quick diagram here, just looking at the factors that can increase climate vulnerability. Obviously, a lot of these conditions are the same conditions that lead to environmental injustice as well. It's language barriers, racism, income disparity, poor living conditions, poor housing conditions, age, location, occupation, and health. All factors that should be taken into consideration when communities are looking at their climate vulnerability assessment. What factors are we using to define who's most vulnerable? And then how do we align that with our environmental justice work and the environmental justice element? There are tools, plenty of great tools available for local governments to use, whether that's looking at the CalEnviroScreen tool to find out who's disadvantaged. If you ever click on any of the census tracts in this tool, you can do a pretty deep dive on all the different components that lead to these higher scores that indicate higher pollution and environmental justice burden. There's also tools and indices that are available to everyone in the state now on the Healthy Places Index. We have the Regional Opportunity Index that was created by UC Davis. Really strongly encourage folks to look at that. And even sort of implementation tools like a healthy development checklist, for example, developed down in Riverside County. So anyway, just kind of providing an example of the landscape of tools and indices and indicators that can really help folks think through how to best plan for and meet the needs and address the health and environmental justice disparities in our disadvantaged communities. So I know I've probably got a little bit over time, but I just want to say thank you very much for allowing me to share my remarks with you today, and happy to answer any questions when it's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. I know that was a ton of information to cover in a short amount of time. But luckily we still have half an hour for discussion. Dan, did you want to, you mentioned taking a couple questions and then letting people break to leave?
Well, I just wanted to say that,
do that now that we're at 8?
I think we're here, thank you all for coming. And if you feel you have to leave, go ahead and leave. We will be here. I will also let you back in if you have to go take a pee break and come back. The recordings will be up later, but I think given that, it's probably a reasonable thing to start in on the questions.
Fantastic.
I know that Taryn early on wondered, let me pull up that tab over here, had a question for Scott. Can you please indicate why analysis stops at downtown rather than continuing up to the Peyron flood zone north of Weir? And I think the answer to that is that this is a simple altitude map, not a hydrological analysis. But Scott, if you want to elaborate on that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's right. So what I showed you was a map from one of the several sea level rise viewers that exist online, and the one I showed was from adaptingtorisingtides.org. So yeah, you can go and you can pick a sea level rise scenario and it shows you the inundation extent. And like Dan was saying, it basically, the models say how high the sea level will be, and then the viewer projects that up the Petaluma River as far as the extent of normal tide. So that's why the sea level rise viewer image that I showed stopped where it did, because that's where that sea level rise viewer has the inland extent of normal tides ending. And I think also in the chat, it said there was a point about this is just, and the storm I talked about was just a storm in the bay pushing water up into the river. The other side of the storm story is rain falling on the watershed and floods coming downstream. And so I didn't show any maps of what a 10 or a 50-year flood event from river flooding would look like, because there is no viewer for that right now. That requires numerical modeling for specific sites to be able to come up with that information.
Also changes quite a bit based on how many buildings you have to slow or sluice off that water. Gina asks, what model source was used for the SLR map slides? Can you speak to the variability between the many current SLR models, sea level rise models, and their assessed probability given sea level rise depths for any given time in the future? And where does the model used in these slides fall in the mean or average of the various models? And asks about a little bit more about that.
Great questions. I guess I honestly can't get into the technical specifications of the sea level rise viewer that I showed. It's the sea level rise viewer that I showed. What you do is you pick a sea level rise amount and it shows you where the sea will go. It doesn't tell you anything about at what point in time that amount of sea level rise will happen. So I guess that's the answer. That's the answer to your first question. It is just a point and click. Show me what 5 feet of sea level rise will flood. Show me what 2 feet will flood. But when is that going to happen? Are we going to see 5 feet by 2050? Or are we going to see 5 feet by 2100? So to get that type of information, there is guidance from the state of California. There is a report that came out in 2018. I'm not sure the specific name of it, but it is State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance Report, I believe is what it's called. And it does have information in there telling you there is a 50% likelihood that we will see X amount of sea level rise by 2050. There is a 5% likelihood we'll see a lot more than that by 2050. So it does give you those ranges of predicted sea level rise amounts by different points in time. So I think that would be a good source to check out for that information.
And Scott, since we're talking about this right now, and I see a reference to it in the chat, when you and I were talking, you were talking about the importance of our wetlands as like a first line of defense there as well.
Right.
You want to just give a brief, I see somebody else talking about the saving our wetlands.
Yeah, right. So, right, we have a really big old marsh in the lower reaches of the Petaluma River and the area where it's tidal. And so we want to protect that marsh for habitat reasons. There's a lot of wildlife that use that marsh and need that marsh. But also in Petaluma and around the bay, tidal marshes also provide defense against sea level rise. So as sea level rises and large storms come into the Petaluma River and large waves come with those large storms, what the tidal wetlands, what the marshes do is they break those waves down and they make them less erosive and make them basically make them do less damage to our shoreline as those waves come in. So it's a nature-based solution to flood management along our shoreline. And so that's, I guess, something to consider when we think about saving our tidal wetlands and our marshes in the Petaluma River and around the bay. Is they do a lot for us. And what we typically think of marshes for is habitat, is helping with water quality, helping clean our water. But it's also important to understand that they do a lot of services for people, and flood protection is one of those big services.
Dan, do you see more questions?
We have more focus on ecological areas, and I was kind of wondering, based on that discussion, what further areas in the limits of the city, or how the general plan can impact the areas around the city to keep those marshes open and to keep migration routes clear and things like that.
Yeah, so migration routes that's a really good one to bring up. So not only do we want to protect the marshes that we have now with the sea level that we have now, but we also want to look inland and protect the areas where those marshes are going to want to migrate inland as sea level continues to rise. So we can give them space to move as sea level rises, but we need to allow that, we need to have that open space there for that to happen. And there are lots of opportunities around Petaluma for that. And, there's a few sources of information to look at for that. The organization that I work for, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, put out a report a few years ago. It was called the Historical Hydrology of the Petaluma River Watershed. So it focused a lot on how conditions, habitat conditions used to look in the mid 1800s and how that compares to what we have now. But it did also have a piece at the end about looking towards the future and the areas that we want to focus on to maintain the habitats that we think are important and bring back habitats that we've lost. And those migration areas was one of those places that we highlighted. So we do have a map in that report that shows those opportunity areas.
John Tribbs says that the SFEI model says we will turn into mudflats by 2080. Does Scott agree with this?
We will turn into mudflats. Wait, everyone on this call is going to turn into mudflats by 2080? I don't like this.
I don't know if I'm going to make it to 2080, but
so John Tribbs, are you talking about that Point Blue report that talks about habitat evolution with different rates of sea level rise?
No, I saw when I was researching, I saw a study that was done with SFEI just the last couple of years, and our wetlands. It had done a large study there, just south of where the Ellis Creek facility is, and that study was saying, okay, we're going to be turning most of our marshland was going to be turning into mudflats by that date with the sea level rise, with the sediment coming in. That it'll be shifting we'll be able to compensate with the marshland for a while, but over time it turned mudflats. So anyway, that was what I've seen in that research report. And I thought if that was, if you've seen it, or if that you agree with that or not.
Yeah, so as sea level rises, habitat changes and marsh drowns and turns into mudflat. And so, right, with the rate of sea level rise that we think that we're planning for in San Francisco Bay region, under the current amount of sediment that we have naturally in the bay, yes, it's likely that we're going to see some transition of habitat within the Petaluma River baylands by the end of the century. But one thing that we are highlighting in a lot of the work that I'm involved in now is, we have an opportunity to bring sediment into the system to help our baylands survive a rising sea level. So there are options to place sediment on baylands to keep them at the elevation that they need to be to stay baylands, to stay wetlands, marshes. And we also have opportunities to bring sediment in and place it in strategic places so that the tide can move that sediment where we need it. So these are efforts that are really being focused on now, because we are realizing that around the bay, Petaluma being one area, but bay-wide, we're realizing that we likely, with the amount of climate change we think is coming our way, we likely will not have enough sediment naturally in the bay to keep all of the wetlands that we have now. So we're going to have to get creative and figure out ways to bring more sediment into the bay to keep the wetlands we have now, the marshes, but also to support all the marshes that we want to restore. So yeah, this topic is getting a lot of attention now, and we're actually getting ready to release a report in mid-March focusing on this exact topic, comparing what we think the demand of our baylands is going to be with respect to sediment and how that's going to compare to supply bay-wide and what we think our options are.
Natasha, do you have?
I have a question for Erik related to this whole topic, kind of bringing it back into the city itself. What advice do you have, or what are you seeing trends wise for communities dealing with sea level rise and water in general? And I know you hit some of the topics, but I know this is a hot topic around the Bay Area about, do you retreat? Do you, build up sediment? Do you build walls? What are people looking at, and what's the latest on that?
Yeah, I mean, Scott was already touching on a lot of some of the really important, I think, preliminary strategies. I know a lot of work is gone into, comprehensively planning for sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay region through the Adapting to Rising Tides project. So, OPR has been a big supporter, sponsor and supporter of that work. It's been a lot of funding, really great work gone into that from the BCDC and other agencies that have been participating. And I think the comprehensive look at sea level rise, it is a slow moving disaster with already we're seeing some near-term consequences, but there's time to put into place the kind of funding mechanisms and projects to begin to move the needle on that. And obviously nature-based solutions, as Scott mentioned, and others I saw in the comments, is a top priority. And I think that that's something that we're tending to see. The Coastal Commission really wants to see folks look at those options where they can, where there's opportunities, and they've got their own guidance for exactly what should be happening in the coastal zone. So we're supportive of those efforts. And I think there's a loading order of just the phasing of what needs to happen. There will, in many places on some of these maps, like you look at some of Scott's maps, we've seen maps like that all over the state in the coastal areas. And there are defined areas where by the end of the century, we will have to have managed retreat happening. There's no question about it. We are seeing it being a very difficult conversation. I mean, you look at the places where that managed retreat discussion has happened, even in communities that claim to be progressive and environmentally friendly and conservation minded, huge pushback from landowners, right, that don't want to give up and don't want to admit that in 10 to 20, maybe 50 years, their house is going to fall off the bluff into the ocean. This is just the thinking, the hubris that people don't even want to admit that it's happening is kind of sad, but it is something that each community has to grapple with in terms of the timing for that really much more aggressive managed retreat scenario. So I would say that, it's a mix of those, looking at nature-based solutions, looking at more drastic options, then all points of in between. I mean, there's so much of the work around sea level rise adaptation it's an infrastructure question as well as looking what's vulnerable in the near term and, what's the lifespan of the asset. And there are agencies, whether it's Caltrans or, wastewater treatment facilities, where folks need to think about, is it time to rebuild that facility in place, retrofit it for another 15 years? Or is it a 50-year lifespan thing and it's coming up due and let's not put it back where it was? So, those decisions about infrastructure and moving it out of harm's way, there are near-term decisions that need to be made where there is a sort of a fork in the road coming. And so that is part of the guidance too, of just thinking critically about, what to do about infrastructure that either could be repeatedly inundated by coastal flooding or eventually fully inundated and underwater. And those are the kind of issues that really are part of that process of looking at how to treat infrastructure too.
Cool. Well, I think we've kind of reached a lull in the conversation. Thank you very, very much. Natasha, you want to take it over? And
Yes. Oh, yes. I want to, if I don't see any more new questions, you didn't see anything new, Dan, that we need to cover? Or should we ready to
there are a
wrap it
few
up?
questions about, well, a few statements, and I don't know how to turn them into the form of a question.
Yes. A lot of
concern-
about the development along the riverfront,
along the river,
the canals, which is an
from the-
ongoing problem.
right. From the
which-
picture that Scott showed and from my own things, I think downtown itself is high enough that doesn't seem a lot of impact except for inflow, but the area between kind of D Street down to I or so in the First and Second Street area has some possible issues, and then the riverfront development area over there I think is a little low and might, but of course that's already been permitted, so I don't know what there is to do there in terms of general plan thinking forward.
Well, the other thing to consider too is that, again, the maps that I was showing for the 2 and 5 feet, 5.5 feet, it was, fair weather conditions.
Yes.
So what I'm not able to show, because I just don't have the modeling results available, is what happens when you have 2 feet of sea level rise and then a 5-year storm coming out of the watershed. When you've got sea level rise is high and then all that water just sits on top, it's got to go somewhere and it's going to flood. It's going to flood parts of Petaluma. So that to me, and I'm not sure if anyone on the call or on this, in this meeting here has seen that type of modeling output, but that to me would be the next logical piece of information, that's needed to really do the planning, the long-term planning.
Yeah, I've got I have been using a web page that was, a project at a conference workshop, which had a slider over elevation models. And I used, of course, it came out of the workshop with a 0 to 100 meters of sea level rise. So it's not terribly useful, but, and the data that it's using for elevation isn't great. But yeah, it doesn't at all capture what happens when the water's flowing.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Since we have 15 minutes technically left, and I don't want to waste any minute with these great speakers, I do have a couple of questions that I had on my list that I'll throw out there. Erik, you have this whole, you talked about the concept of sprawl repair, which I think is a great way, I like that framing and that concept. And you talked a little bit about it, but do you have any other little, any details that might be interesting to our group to think about as we look at some of the, especially as we're looking at the downtown, which is our non-sprawl area, happens to be right along the river where we might be having the most problems. So as we look at our outlying areas that are more sprawl-like, how do we make those more walkable, livable, enjoyable? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we can look at the land use pattern that's there, and one question would be like, where are the vacant sites and opportunities, not just for more housing, but for other uses? Maybe it's finding the little places to put the pocket parks or the places that people want to gather. Maybe it's a nicely designed pocket park with a small cafe or just some mixed use development nearby. And that concept of the walkable 20-minute neighborhood comes from Portland, and they've done a really excellent job of creating a comprehensive vision for their city that they do really have walkability sheds defined, and they know what it's going to take from an infrastructure investment standpoint, as well as those tactical land use decisions to make sure that walkability, that 20-minute walkability is achieved. So, definitely encourage, everyone always says, look at Portland and it gets annoying in the planning community, but it's actually true. They've done a really good job. Another great community to look at is Vancouver. Vancouver has done such an amazing job. Vancouver, BC, of course, not Washington, but Vancouver, BC has just done an incredible job of rethinking their land use patterns and their developed areas of their city and matching that with infrastructure and sort of community infrastructure like parks and open spaces. Another really powerful tool to connect neighborhoods is just this idea of, on-street dedicated greenways, or at least, channelized walking and biking paths. And we have so much pavement on so many roads that are, 4 to 6 lane roads. They're awful roads. They're just designed to move cars. And we're coming to a place where maybe we can take some of those lanes away. This idea of doing road dieting. Road dieting is feasible, and it's happening all over the state now. It used to be kind of a novel idea. But Caltrans is actively funding these projects, and we actually now can exempt those projects from CEQA. We just, there was a bill that passed last year, SB 288, that exempts a lot of sustainable transportation projects, whether it's road diets, active transportation, greenways, bike trails, walking trails. A lot of it can be exempt from CEQA now, statutory exemption. So tell your decision makers, tell Public Works, go to town. Now's the time to start planning and implementing those projects. We've cleared the way on the CEQA side to let those happen when they meet certain criteria, right? That they're not going to really pave over any critical habitat as long as they're maybe in the existing right-of-way. You're good to go. You don't need to fight an EIR battle with the 2 homeowners who are going to sue over CEQA because they don't like a 10-foot bike path. So, this is the kind of stuff we're trying to do at the state to advance the stuff. And hopefully, SB 288 combined with this more robust integrated thinking about livable, walkable, connected neighborhoods really begins to take shape.
I see that we've got a couple new comments here. And Sharon, oops, now it's moving around. Sharon was asking about financing needs. Or how when we talk about financing needed changes, are we talking principally state municipal funding or private or a combination?
Was that it? So
do you I think it's mostly that, so that's probably for you, Erik.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, so when we're talking about financing all of this, we're talking about doing a lot of stuff in the next 9 years as as Pete put it also. So how are we going to finance this? And is there, state, municipal, and private funding?
Yeah, I would say it's all of the above, right? There is such a need to fund all these different types of projects to address climate. And, so much work has gone into already trying to fund the initial responses to climate change, especially on the greenhouse gas mitigation side, through cap and trade revenues, right? Like this was one of the big give backs from that program, is to reinvest those dollars, those proceeds from the quarterly auctions into projects and programs that directly reduce emissions in communities. So, California Climate Investments is what we call that set of programs now. And obviously a lot of those dollars are being leveraged locally. But the idea that local financing is a part of the equation as well. Some of the grants that are coming out around climate responses do require local matches or local commitments. So that's always definitely in the picture. And I believe, innovation around financing infrastructure, there's a lot of work still being done. I mentioned enhanced infrastructure financing districts, EIFDs. That's just one in a series of local financing tools in the toolbox to look at infrastructure changes to support higher density mixed use infill type development scenarios. So definitely encourage folks to kind of look into that, and your local decision makers are going to be doing as they put the implementation programs together for the general plan is, how are we going to pay for this? It's one thing to say we'll do it, but is there a feasible pathway to get there? Knowing that there are always limited funds. Unfortunately, a lot of the state funding programs tend to be one time or 2 to 3 years and they go away. We try to have those conversations with the state decision makers and the legislatures of providing sustainable, ongoing, or reliable streams for the kind of climate investments we need to do things more at scale. There's been a climate bond that was put in front of the legislature several times. It was done last year and then taken off. It's back in the mix this year in the governor's proposed budget, and it's a really big bond. If it does get put on the ballot in November, potentially could be a big source of funding to look at not just climate adaptation, but not just greenhouse gas mitigation, but really, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars more, if not billions, that would go to climate resilience projects statewide for restoration projects. There's a nature-based solutions piece. There's a wildfire mitigation and forest health, a WUI piece, right? There's all these different pieces in that bond that could be very powerful if the legislature does approve that to go on the ballot. And of course, the voters would have to say yes in order to make that work.
And then Ned asked about funding through a public bank. Do you have any comments on that?
By public bank, do we mean like a government run, like a revolving loan fund?
I'm not sure.
Something along those lines. There is a bill in the legislature currently that's being considered. It's the Dodd bill, SB 440. Folks might want to take a look at that. It would actually create a revolving loan fund for certain types of buyouts. So this is one of the first things that we've seen that actually funds potentially would provide a state funding framework for buyouts. It's sort of a new idea. We don't have any, from where I sit, we haven't fully analyzed the bill, so I can't comment if it's a good bill or not. But it is something that's new that we're tracking in terms of innovative public banking type ideas. There's other ideas that have been floated too by various stakeholders over the years. We know that one of the big opportunities from a land use planning and funding perspective is TDR, or transfer of development rights. TDR is a very complex process. It requires us, buying out lands that are either high habitat, high conservation value, or have high hazard and high risk. So we're seeing increased movement and interest in different state agencies as well as different conservation organizations about possibly doing something as innovative as a statewide TDR fund. One of the big challenges for those that don't understand how transfer of development rights work is that it's like a conservation easement, but it's basically someone buys the development rights off of a parcel that has conservation or hazard mitigation value. And those rights are then exchanged to somewhere that has opportunity, and that it's called the receiving area. So the sitting area is where you don't want to see the development, the receiving area is where you want it. And it's a very complex set of market exchanges because someone has to actually buy those rights, but then If it's a developer who wants to buy those, there's actually a net increase in cost. So from a market transfer perspective, it often doesn't make sense. And in California, where we have density bonus law in effect, there really is no perceived value in most theoretical receiving areas. So we've got a bit of a market distortion there, but one thing the state or other entities could do, it could be a multi-sector partnership, is to scale up something to reduce that market distortion, actually provide value for a TDR type transactions. So it could be a statewide TDR bank, it could be regional banks. There's a lot of different discussions going on right now on how to make transfer development rights more feasible so that we could actually see kind of quote unquote buyouts in high habitat or conservation or high hazard or high risk areas, and have being willing recipients in the receiving area with not a lot of incremental cost to take on those rights. So, something innovative we hope to see happen, but there really is no mechanism right now, and no one's quite in agreement yet on what to push forward as sort of like a proposal. So.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. I think we're getting so much great information here. And I think we're almost done. Pete, if you are still there and you want to give us any, I know we rushed you through, so if you're still there and you want to give us any highlights about all the exciting stuff that's happening in Sonoma County on a more regional level, because I know you're tapped into that, and there's been a lot of momentum, and since 2 years ago, so many things have changed. Do you want to just give a few brief words of inspiration from there?
Oh, tapped in or tapped out?
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that in 2019, Governor Newsom signed AB 857, a public banking law, which laid the groundwork for the creation of 10 new public banks, regional banks, which would, similar to the Bank of North Dakota, make money available to small local banks for local lending. That's an answer to not to the question that you asked, but to a different question. It touched on Ned's question. In Sonoma County, we now have the distinction of being the only county in the country where all the local jurisdictions have passed some sort of climate emergency resolution. And that took place over the period of a little over 2 years. No, actually a little under 2 years. And that was a relatively easy step, but now the hard work begins. And what is so clear to me is that what's needed is a fully engaged public working with their elected leadership, pushing for the kind of watershed monumental changes that will really be required of us in order to come close to our climate goals. So one thing that I just wanted to mention is the launch of a new website that I had some involvement in. It's imaginesonomacounty.com, and it's an effort at putting together a crowdsourced vision of the future that we want to create. I'll leave it at that. So Natasha, thanks for putting this all together. The prayers.
Yes, I want to chat. Yes, thank you so much. And check out that website that Pete just mentioned. Maybe we can drop that in the chat. It's actually really fun to go through too. It's a very creative way of crowdsourcing ideas and getting everybody involved. And I'm very excited to see that launched and moving forward. And I want to give a great big thanks to Pete and Erik and Scott for being my guest speakers tonight, and for all of you who stuck around for the full hour and a half. I know we had so much to cover, and I think that Dan will probably give you a quick review of the upcoming Know Before You Grows. I know you were putting some in the chat there, but some of the stuff that people were getting into, more environmental stuff around the river, and we are going to have a whole nother context setting that's going to go deeper into that. So you'll get more information on that in a few weeks.
So sure, I'll shill in 3 weeks, we're having a kind of introduction to housing issues. And in 5 weeks, we're having an introduction to the ecology around the area, including with a special focus on the river. All of that is available at urbanchat.org. We also have a tradition of recognizing the elected and appointed officials who show up. And I haven't been doing that because I invariably miss somebody, also because we don't want to drag people in for Brown Act stuff. But we have a running gag here because Dave missed Delinda Fisher so many times at the in-person meetings. I have to thank Delinda Fisher for attending. With that, thank you very, very much. I will put the recordings up as soon as all of the computers process things so that you can share this session with your friends and have it for future things. Thank you again, Natasha, for putting this together. Thank you very much, Scott and Erik, for speaking with us. And we will see you in 3 weeks.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Cool.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Fantastic session.